is Friday, and we are working for Crusoe, Friday, November 22nd, 2024. In Los Angeles, he is Sam Park. In Los Angeles, I am John Ramey. November 22nd is an important date historically in the United States. And on this anniversary of that important historical date, we now take time to document clearly the waning influence of the United States on the world stage, Sam Park. We have Joe Biden taking his farewell tour. And many, perhaps cynical headline writers have characterized this as too little, too late, but they're right. So we'll start with Joe Biden visiting the 31st APEC Economic Leaders Meeting in Lima, Peru. But we will also talk about COP29, the climate summit in Azerbaijan, and the G20 meeting in Rio de Janeiro, where all our rowdy friends showed up. Let's start with APEC. So this is notable because President Xi Jinping of China and Joe Biden met, and Xi basically said, you need to let the incoming government, the incoming administration know, here are 4 red lines. He kind of level set where China's going to start with the incoming second Trump administration. Do I have that right?
I think that's basically right. Yeah. Now, we weren't sure who was going to show up at APEC last week when we talked about this. And mainly that's because nobody in the news media is telling us anything about what Joe Biden's doing until they forget that he's still the president, or that is they remember that he's still the president. It's like, oh, yeah. So probably around the time that we were recording last week's episode, Biden was actually appearing in Lima, Peru, where the conference was being held. So, yes, I don't know why Xi figures that he can't. Maybe I guess there's some diplomatic awkwardness in contacting the Trump team directly, right? So he has to have Biden pass along the message.
So the four hot button issues per Xi are Taiwan, democracy and human rights, China's path and system, which seems a bit vague, and then China's rights to development. Basically, it's hands off China, U.S. Hands off.
Essentially, yes. And, I mean, this shouldn't be any sort of surprise, but it sort of stands in contrast to what we recall from last year's APEC summit in San Francisco, where there was this sort of almost serene encounter between Xi and Biden, where they're sort of walking amongst the hedgerows by themselves with no staff around, and everything seemed like it was just groovy, man.
Well, it is groovy in San Francisco. Sam. Well, maybe it was just, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, that's what I hear.
But they were showing each other their limousines.
Yeah, it was all very nice, and now it's just like, well, okay, since you're on your way out, sorry. But the fact is, a lot of things have happened since then. And I think that that Xi is probably not incorrect if he expects that his relations with the incoming administration might be rather contentious. That seems to be pretty likely, frankly.
Xi's explicit message, this is from Business Insider, Xi's explicit message is notable because it appears to be the first time that, quote, red lines have been issued at the presidential level. This is a quote from Igor Krestin, a managing director of global policy at the George W. Bush Institute, a think tank. Now, red lines.
I didn't know he had an institute.
Yeah, I know, right? Yeah, I know. There you go.
How nice for him.
I know.
I'm sorry, please go on.
Nice of Igor Krestin to talk to Business Insider to let us know about the George W. Bush Institute.
Who knew?
Well, it's later every day, right? It's 2024. He's not been president for 16 years, 15
Sure,
years.
Yeah. I mean, he's entitled.
You can't paint all the time. Look, the American people have spoken, and the United States is no longer very serious about global leadership. And so I guess we should just get used to China and other adversarial countries telling us how it's going to work.
Well, I think it's sort of an important nexus for Xi to be able to do this, right? Where, as we've discussed, Biden's kind of been a lame duck since July. And so many people, I think, would be justified if they felt like the United States sort of doesn't have a president right now. And so it's easy to sort of push the United States around just at this moment. And so I think that once Trump actually takes office, Xi might moderate his tone a little bit. I expect he actually will.
Okay. ABC reporting Joe Biden taking maybe his final lap on the world stage. The meeting with Xi Jinping. Biden also visited the Amazon rainforest.
Yes, the first United States president to do so.
So he went to a picket line and he visited a rainforest.
Yes.
Sorry,
he seemed to almost get lost in the rainforest.
He did actually. That was there was an interesting optical moment when he was finished at the podium. First of all, a podium in a rainforest, weird.
Yeah,
but he had like the cool navy blue kind of safari shirt, and then he turned around and walked into the rainforest as if he was looking for a door to go through.
Or just sort of vanishing into the jungle at the end of his life. It was really rather poignant.
Yes. So he visits a jungle and 2 major summits. And like, is it cynical or is it correct to say it's too little too late?
I mean, I think it's certainly helpful. And he also,
specifically on South America, given China's opening the port, as we discussed last week in Peru, right? Like, he's like, oh, we're going to lose South America to China. I'd better get over there. And it's too late.
Well, I mean, I think he was going to go anyway, right? I mean, it's not like he's going to skip APEC or the G20.
Right, but it's his first trip to the other America. I mean, it's right there in our hemisphere.
Yes. Well, I think that we understand today in a way that we didn't in the early time of his administration. That
100%.
That, his staff was wary of taxing him over much, right? And that's, I think, something that will be explored by journalists and authors of books in the coming months and years as to exactly what was going on inside the Biden administration. How sort of protective that people were of him and not wanting to strain him too much in his old years. And that's really, I think, a very disturbing story. And it's sad.
It is sad, but it needs to be told.
Oh, yes, very much.
Because it very clearly, I mean, again, Joe Biden didn't go to South America till right now, the waning weeks of his presidency. And, I don't know about you, Sam, but just from the perspective of our podcast covering international affairs and economics, certainly on the international stage, I'm having kind of a radical reassessment of what to think about the Biden administration's performance through their 4 years, nearly 4-year term.
I think that this is a question that will vex historians for quite some time to come.
Because they did a good job objectively, but politically they failed.
That's right. And not just politically, but geopolitically, right? When we started this podcast, we talked a lot about the United States competing for influence amongst nations of the global South with countries such as China, India, sort of the BRICS group.
Russia.
Well, yeah. And it doesn't seem like that contest had gone especially well under the presidency of Joe Biden. Now, I'm not saying it's going to go especially well at all under Trump either. And that's, I think, the worst part about it is that no matter which of our two parties is in charge, it just doesn't seem like global leadership in the most important regions of the world going forward is something that we're going to be able to count on.
It's not an American political priority.
No, and it never has been. For instance, John, and I don't mean to find fault with you about this, but many times during the course of our doing this podcast, you've used the term Pax Americana. And if you live in the global South, you have no idea what that means. Okay, that's not.
I don't care, but I understand your point.
You don't care?
I'm saying there's no nuclear war. So if you're not experiencing a nuclear war in an African republic, I know you're not thinking about the Pax Americana, but it's benefiting you.
Okay, what if you're experiencing a decades-long civil war in which the United States and its allies are implicated? Are you thinking, all right? You actually are thinking about the Pax Americana in that case, and you're thinking about it very badly.
Yes, but it's still less bad. I understand if you live for... I understand.
For whom? Less bad for whom?
Look, it's not fair.
I mean, if you live in Vietnam, all right?
I totally agree. But Again, 5 million dead in Southeast Asia is not a nuclear exchange. Okay. It's terrible. It's a tragedy. It's a human catastrophe. But those are the kinds of things that I'm talking about, that the United States, for all its sins, has maintained a, a nuclear peace, a great power peace. And now we've just completely decided to not engage in that and see what happens. And we're starting to see it on this farewell tour of Joe Biden, the last president of the 20th century, or the Pax Americana.
If you live outside the Western world, you might say that the United States has outsourced its great power wars instead of maintaining a great power peace, and outsourced them onto your country instead of having the sort of decency to fight your own wars.
But I'm not saying that's, I don't disagree with that. I'm just saying, what's the alternative? A great power, right?
I don't know, but I'm not certain that the alternative is nuclear war between Western and or Soviet nations, right?
Well, we're going to find out now.
Well, yeah. I mean, it turns out that outsourcing in many cases doesn't actually last all that long. It can't be sustained.
Listen, again, the Pax Americana, not perfect. And you're right. You know, I have
used the term. No. I'm not saying it's not perfect. I'm saying it might be bad. Okay. And even if I don't think so, there are a billion plus people who have every right to think so. That's all I'm saying.
Is the Pax, is the Russo-Sino hegemony going to be better?
Look, I'm not saying it's going to be, right? In fact, it looks like it's not going to be right now. But that's not my decision to make for those people. And these sorts of issues will play out in the rest of our discussion today in various ways.
Anyway, yeah. Any other thoughts about the Pax Americana?
No, not right now. Okay. I mean, we can move on to the G20. I mean, that's really where a lot of this is playing out.
All right. So the G20 taking place in Rio de Janeiro. And all of our rowdy friends are there. Javier Milei of Argentina, Lula, president of Brazil.
Well, it's his summit. Yeah. Of course he's there.
Right. But like, it's everybody. It's Schultz. It's Macron. Sergei Lavrov was there. What's that?
Not Putin.
No, Lavrov goes instead of Putin from Russia.
Yes.
Show favorite Ursula von der Leyen from European Union. And, everybody's there, even Erdogan. So they wanted to talk about the G20, social inclusion in the fight against hunger, energy transition and sustainable development, and reform of the global governance institutions. So did they solve it all, Sam?
No, not even close. It's weird to me that this is happening at the same time as the COP29, because there's so much overlap in all these discussions, and you can't be everywhere. And it sort of, I feel like it sort of gave COP29 short shrift, frankly.
But it's kind of like scheduling competing weddings or something.
Yeah, I mean, it's I get that there's a lot of people involved, right? But you'd think that people would kind of get the organizational ball and get their ducks in a row.
AP reporting from La Paz. Last year, then presidential candidate from Argentina, Javier Milei, declared Argentina would not, quote, make deals with communists in China or Brazil, calling their leaders murderers and thieves in a bid to channel populist energies. But Tuesday of this week, President Milei found himself at the Group of 20 summit in Rio, shaking hands with Chinese President Xi Jinping and vowing to boost trade with China a day after his economy minister signed a preliminary agreement to export Argentine natural gas to Brazil. Milei even acquiesced to a joint declaration endorsed by world leaders earlier on Monday, despite his earlier attempts to play spoiler to the G20 host, Brazil's left-wing president Lula, who was once called by Milei a corrupt communist. So what's the lesson there, Sam? Once you get in office, you got to play ball.
Exactly. I mean, it's a lot easier to sort of throw stones until you move into your glass house, which Argentina certainly is, right? I mean, they've had terrible economic problems with which Milei, to his credit, seems to be making a good start at taking care of. But they're still in very bad shape, and he can't afford to, be all that confrontational with major trading partners of his own country, including Brazil and China. And so he was going to have to come to some arrangement, and it sort of feels like he wanted to be seen to be doing so, kicking and screaming, right? And it says,
but he didn't bring his chainsaw.
No, well, I mean, John, I don't think he's actually used the chainsaw since becoming president, right? Again, that's the kind of thing that you do when you're the candidate, yeah. Right? Once you become the president, maybe you want to use a regular saw.
Any other thoughts about the G20?
Well, I mean, we could do a whole episode on the G20, but again, it's all part of this weird interregnum lame duck session where people don't want to kind of make a lot of plans right now. I will say that on President Biden's behalf, he pledged, I think it was $4 to $5 billion to a global campaign to combat world hunger. Now that's, not all that money and all that much money inside of the United States budget, but it's quite a lot of money just in general terms. And so, the United States helping to end world hunger, that's pretty good. And so we should be happy about that. And
yeah, our voters would have preferred we use that to bring down the price of eggs, Sam.
Well, I mean, the problem is, and this is seldom discussed, the price of eggs is really about bird flu, right? And so unless we're going to end bird flu.
Hey, we don't have time for those kind of nuanced discussions in the United States.
No, I know. But that's, if the price of eggs is really what people could get mad at, they're going to stay mad for a while.
I think that might be your most accurate prediction.
Probably.
Yeah. One note about the G20. First time full G20 summit occurred with the African Union as a member. The African Union was included during the previous summit in 2023. So welcome to the G20 African Union.
Yeah, it's about time too, right? And you'd think that maybe this might have happened earlier, but I'm glad it's happening now anyway.
Okay. COP29?
Sure.
Okay. Al Jazeera reporting. Negotiations at the COP29 climate conference have extended into overtime after an offer by wealthy countries to provide $250 billion a year in climate financing for developing countries was roundly rejected. The presidency of the global talks in Baku, Azerbaijan, released a draft finance deal today, which it insisted was the result of, quote, an extensive and inclusive consultation process. The presidency of the global talks said developed countries would provide $250 billion annually by 2035 to developing or poor nations to deal with damage from climate change and to adapt to that change. But the figure, which came as a modest upgrade from the $100 billion annual pledge that was agreed to 15 years ago and is ending this year, angered many representatives of developing countries who said their rich counterparts are refusing to take responsibility for the climate crisis they've caused. Vulnerable nations are asking for $1.3 trillion annually. Yeah, I mean, just conceptually, it's hard to put a price on damage to the climate, but those who are dealing with the consequences are attempting to, and those who have caused it are obviously trying to negotiate how much they have to pay. I mean, it's kind of crass on one level, but it's also, you could understand how the leaders of rich countries are like, well, I can't go back with this, right?
Sure. I mean, yeah. But it's...
My voters are worried about the price of eggs. Nobody cares about hurricanes somewhere they don't live.
That's right. But you know what? The hurricanes are now happening where they do live, right?
That's true.
We've seen all these...
With increasing intensity.
Yeah. There were wildfires in New Jersey last week. And, drought conditions in New England. And
so, Sam, why are we sending $1.3 trillion to other places when we have to deal with climate change in our own country? And it's not just the United States. I mean, any rich country could say this.
Sure. And that is why it's going to be a political difficulty to do these things. And I think that, again, a lot of the wealthier countries, even if they have a great deal of disdain for Donald Trump, they're sort of hiding behind him and sort of saying, okay, look, we're going to offer you $250 billion, even though we didn't even meet the pledge of $100 billion anywhere near on time. And we packaged a lot of that in the form of loans. And just so our listeners understand, loans are not compensation, right? I mean, that's it. It's just ridiculous. And so, I mean, it's not just,
and they're saying, and you better play ball with us because the guy coming into the White House is going to be way worse.
You'll be lucky if you get a penny. And I think that's, as you say, kind of crass. But I think that's also part of the reason that the developing countries asked for $1.3 trillion just so that they had a place to go. Right. I mean, but this $250 billion, they're not even happy with that. And that's why we're in overtime at COP29. But this is going to be a problem going forward because the wealthy nations just don't seem to want to come up with the money. And John, I know I've spoken to you about this personally before. And I'm kind of surprised that, I mean, because I've heard many people from the global south at COP29 this week talking about, the reasons why the wealthy nations need to come up with the money and how disappointed that they are that they're not, and how ridiculous it is that part of it is loans and all these things. But so far, I really thought that this might be the year that somebody from some developing nation would say, listen, all of you wealthy Western countries seem to have big political issues with immigration.
Right. It's the other side of the coin.
That's right. And if you don't want to pay us the money to stay in our country, you might as well, you're just going to end up paying our citizens when they get to your country. Do you want to pay us here or do you want to pay us there? And then at some point, that's what this is going to boil down to. But the developing nations, I think, rather diplomatically, actually, haven't come forward to say this so far. One thing I will say in defense of the richer nations is that a lot of the poor nations to whom this money will be going have big problems with corruption. Of course, what rich nations do too. But money given to governments of poor nations doesn't necessarily always end up where it's supposed to go.
I see what you mean.
And that's something that's difficult to hash out. But the other major, I think, development in COP29, which has been sort of bubbling up for a while, but really has come to the fore this year, is where is China, right? Because China will tell you that they are the representative of the global South, right? But
they're the top polluter too.
Yeah, they're also the top polluter. But people in the developing world are like, okay, you are. For instance, China likes to say, when it suits their purpose, that they're still a developing nation themselves. And that, I think, is difficult for actual poor nations to swallow, right? China's really what we would call an upper middle income country, right? They're not poor. And for them to act as though they're the champion of the poor countries kind of leaves a bad taste in the mouth of actual poor countries, right? Because as you say, they're the biggest emitter. They're still burning lots of coal.
Yeah, they're the biggest polluter and the second biggest economy in the world. I mean, is that just vestigial Maoist kind of sentiment?
Oh, partly, yes, but it's all
we're for the worker, we're for the proletariat, we're for the common man.
But it serves a geopolitical purpose today as well, right? Because their competitor for influence at least has been the United States, and so they're the ones who would like to say, "We're with you, sticking it to the man," right? The big bad United States, and it doesn't help that if the United States is going to pull out of the Paris Climate Accords again. And things like this, and stand in the way of a greater amount of compensation being paid to poor countries, which that really they're certainly not rushing to compensate these countries, and so this kind of gives China a pass. to their credit, even, the people from the developing nations who are kind of skeptical about China posing as the champion of the global South, they will concede at least China's bringing technological solutions to bear on the
battery
climate problem.
technologies.
Yeah, at scale, right? I mean, and they're providing them to developing nations, right? So, China isn't going to be part of the compensation that is the financial compensation for climate change, but they are not quite donating, but at least providing the technology which could help bring the climate crisis to an end, and actually is helping lower carbon emissions every day.
Perhaps listeners will notice in this episode the there's just a nihilism I can't shake now about international affairs.
Yes,
because I mean, it's just, and I wanted to believe, I think between the two of us, I've been kind of the more naive, optimistic believer in some American, if not exceptionalism, leadership or virtue in the world stage. And now that is very clearly been rejected by Americans. And so what's our best hope now? That somehow Elon Musk, something, Tesla batteries, and we'll be able to scale somehow through kind of bumbling corruption and somehow compete with the Chinese in battery technology? Because
I don't think we're going to be able to compete with them. I think that Musk will sort of muddle through, right? He'll probably maintain
I mean, of all the oligarchs to have corrupt influence over the incoming president, he's the best in a weird way, in terms of climate.
I would say so, but all he'll do, I think, right, is maintain the level of subsidy that he gets. In other words, Trump has spoken out against electric vehicles for years, right? He hates them. I think it's partly just because he has this atavistic idea that cars should go instead of, right? That's just how he thinks of a car, right? But now that he's buddies with Elon, he'll let Elon slide and maintain all the sort of EV credits that he's been getting from other automakers to compensate for their failure to build commercially viable electric vehicles. And I think that's mainly what Musk is trying to do here, right? Is to maintain the sort of the relations that his companies have with the government at their current level, or perhaps even expand upon that, right? And so it's very easy to understand.
So Musk is not the solution to not scaling battery technology here.
No, I don't think so. I mean, I mean, if he comes up with some major technological breakthrough in batteries, that would be fantastic. And it's certainly possible.
Look, he could. He's a good engineer.
It's certainly possible, right? But the fact is that Chinese companies are doing this every day. They're doing it every day, and there's a bunch of them. They compete with one another to do so. And they're the ones who are actually bringing these technologies to the countries of the global South. Musk isn't doing that, right? I'm sure he'd like to, right? But it's a big job. Why does China build all these ports, right? I mean, this is how they project their influence. That port in Shanghai in Peru, what do you know? That's as far west in South America as you can go. It's the closest place in South America to China, right? It's not an accident that they build one of their biggest ports there. And they're going to keep on doing this. And so as far as climate change goes, the United States will probably end up being the laggard in terms of technology. Meanwhile, however, they will probably end up having the advantage in artificial intelligence. That's just a guess, but and China's certainly working. They have their own artificial intelligence companies, but we don't know much about them because they're generally just for domestic consumption in China. It's really the alternative energy companies that China is sponsoring that are going to be the arena in which they begin to best the United States. And it's one that's important to countries all around the world. And that's really the lesson of COP29, right? Is all these countries saying, we need to do something about this, and China's the only one actually doing it. What do they care about AI? Right? I mean, it's not something that maybe that, sure, I'm sure they'd like to use it, right? It's not really top of.
You mean rank and file global South person?
Yeah,
Right.
if you live in Botswana, do you really care that much about artificial intelligence?
Right. You're not trying to automate your newsroom or your content
No,
farm.
I mean it's just they've got other things to worry about, and so I that's one of the reasons I wanted to end this today's episode with COP29, because that's really where it's all coming down, right? In the G20, it's not everybody, right? It's just the 20 nations, and you have maybe some observer nations, right? APEC is just the Pacific Rim, right? In COP29, anybody can go, right?
Right. It's
And
the
you're
UN.
yeah, it's sort of like, yeah, exactly. It is a UN sponsored event. And so you're really getting the most comprehensive view of the world from there. And that view is the poor nation standing up and saying, you got to come up with this, right? You're screwing us over, and you've been doing it for years, and we're tired of it. So please stop doing it.
Another reflection I've had since the American election is just how challenging the information ecosystem is. And again, as a journalist, as somebody who started in journalism in the 20th century, as somebody who was a second generation journalist, the I have maybe been slow to accept the erosion of the traditional information flow. I certainly understood it was changing and has been for 30 years, Sam, but
well, it's accelerated a lot recently.
It has accelerated a lot. And, I don't think that that our little podcast is, going to reverse the tides of history, but there is something about like, I do now think it is important for us just as lay people to present this in such an unvarnished and unoptimized way. And I hope that, we do have a consistent audience, and I know we have a consistent audience, and I hope that it continues to matter to folks, because, the thought crossed my mind that maybe we shouldn't do this anymore because of the nihilism I mentioned earlier. I mean, not to make this about my feelings, but it is challenging to look at the state of affairs in the world and see kind of what has been the natural place of the United States abdicated, at least in my lifetime, abdicated.
Now,
and so that's, I am finding some purpose now in just trying to keep a tiny little candle flickering in the breeze, in the hurricane, and the maelstrom of terrible information that's glued to everybody's face while we all do this 24 hours a day.
Oh, I understand exactly what you mean, and I agree with you. But to return to one of our topics from earlier today, in the weird way, the good news is that if you're from the global South, Donald Trump doesn't actually seem all that unusual to you. You've had leaders like him in your country,
sure.
Right? And so you might come to an easier understanding of what's happening than some of our European friends, for that matter.
Or certainly us.
Yeah, and so there's an opportunity here, right? In other words, just because we think Donald Trump is terrible, and he is, but people in other parts of the world are at least not as shocked, right? And so they might, in other words, this doesn't necessarily reduce their opinion of us. Again, because the Pax Americana was never for them.
For them, right.
Okay. And so to them, it's not really that big a downgrade. It's NATO that is really really on tenterhooks about this, right? But people in the global South, they can
garden variety strongman, variety corrupt illiberal.
They can wait it out and see what happens. And that's, again, kind of the weird good news here.
Cool. We'll end it on weird good news.
Yeah.
We'll talk, Ukraine next week?
Next week, we'll be recording ahead of time, and we'll discuss both Ukraine and the Middle East. That is, we're recording ahead of time because of the holiday. And where both of those conflicts stand at that time. They're developing very rapidly right now, and I expect there'll be a lot of developments between now and then. And so we'll take a look at where they are at that point and engage in some hopefully relatively informed speculation as to where they might go under the incoming administration and even before the administration takes office.
All right. He's Sam. I'm John. Hope you've enjoyed the episode. We'll be back next Friday. We will record on Wednesday, but we will release on Friday after Thanksgiving. We'll be back with Working for Crusoe. So have yourselves a great weekend.
Happy holidays, everybody.